For 9 years, my family treated me like a pathetic, unemployed burden. They loved using me as the punchline at their wealthy country club dinners. They had absolutely no idea what I really did for a living or the kind of power I held. But when my supposedly dementia-ridden grandmother slipped me a desperate coded plea for help, under the table I stopped playing the helpless daughter. 30 minutes later, I was standing on their front porch with 2 federal officers ready to tear their entire fake empire to the ground. My name is Chloe, and I am 34 years old. Before I continue the story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. The heavy leather billfold slapped against my porcelain dinner plate. The sharp sound cut right through the polite murmur of the exclusive downtown Chicago steakhouse. I stared down at the receipt. $4,500. My father, William, leaned back in his tufted leather chair and took a slow, deliberate sip of his expensive scotch. He looked at me with an expression of complete disgust. Since Chloe has spent the last 9 years finding herself on her couch, he announced, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear, "She can at least cover the tip tonight." My mother, Victoria, let out a soft, condescending laugh. She adjusted her diamond necklace and looked at me with profound pity. "Do not overwhelm her." "William," she sighed, resting her manicured hand on his arm, "you know she cannot handle adult responsibilities." Sitting across from me, my younger sister Harper leaned forward. Harper was 31, the undisputed golden child, and the CEO of a massive organic lifestyle brand. She flipped her perfect blonde hair and smiled a venomous, sickly sweet smile. "Honestly, Chloe, I feel bad for you," Harper said, swirling her champagne. "I can give you a discount code for my new skincare line. You could buy some wholesale and resell it online for a little pocket money. It is better than doing absolutely nothing with your life." Next to Harper, her fiancé Marcus let out a smooth, rich chuckle. Marcus was a 35-year-old venture capitalist and a striking African-American man in a flawless, custom-tailored suit whom my parents worshipped. He always played the part of the polished, wealthy aristocrat. He adjusted his diamond cufflinks and shook his head, looking at me as if I were a tragic charity case. I kept my face completely blank. I did not cry and I did not argue. I simply slid my left hand under the heavy white tablecloth and rested my fingers against the cold, matte black metal of my phone. It was not a normal consumer device. It was a heavily encrypted military-grade terminal linked directly to the United States Treasury Department. My family thought I was a jobless loser who dropped out of graduate school due to a mental breakdown. They had no idea I was a senior financial investigator for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. For 9 years, I had not been sitting on a couch. I had been tracking offshore laundering operations, dismantling international fraud syndicates, and putting cartel accountants in federal prison. My salary was 5 times what my father made, and my security clearance required absolute secrecy. So I sat there and let them treat me like garbage because blowing my undercover status was a federal offense. I was fully prepared to just pay the absurd bill and leave to protect my identity. But as I reached for my purse, the woman sitting to my right suddenly shifted. My grandmother Claire was 82 years old. According to my parents, she was suffering from severe rapid-onset dementia. They claimed she needed round-the-clock supervision and kept her heavily medicated in their sprawling suburban mansion. All evening, Claire had sat completely silent, staring blankly at the floral centerpiece and occasionally spilling water on her silk blouse. My parents completely ignored her, treating her like a broken piece of furniture. As my hand brushed near her lap, her arm shot out under the table with terrifying speed. Her grip was like a steel vise. Her cold, bony fingers clamped around my wrist so hard I almost gasped. I glanced at her face. Her expression had not changed at all. She still wore that exact same vacant, lost stare, but her thumb pressed desperately into my pulse point. She slowly opened her palm, revealing a crumpled white cocktail napkin. With agonizing care, she slid the napkin into my hand and immediately let go, returning to her perfect performance of a broken woman who no longer knew where she was. My heart hammered against my ribs. I slowly lowered my hands to my lap and unfolded the paper under the table. It was not a random scribble. It was a precise, clearly written 9-digit bank routing number followed by an offshore account prefix that I recognized instantly from my federal cases. Below the numbers, written with a shaky but deliberate hand, was a single, frantically underlined word: help. I stood up from the table, pushing my chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, drawing the attention of my entire arrogant family. I kept my posture submissive and excused myself quietly, saying I just needed a moment to use the restroom. My father scoffed loudly, telling the table I was probably running away from the bill, just like I ran away from every responsibility in my life. Harper laughed her signature tinkling laugh. I did not look back. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the women's lounge and locked myself in the furthest stall. The mask of the helpless daughter instantly dropped. I pulled out my encrypted government terminal and bypassed 3 layers of biometric security. I logged directly into the federal tracking system right there in the bathroom. The stark blue interface illuminated the small tiled space. I entered the routing number my grandmother had slipped me. The system spun for a few agonizing seconds, running rapid cross-checks through international banking protocols. When the results populated on my glowing screen, all the breath left my lungs. I was looking at a live, active wire transfer. $3.8 million was currently in the process of being drained from my grandmother's irrevocable trust account. I tapped the screen, drilling down into the transaction details. The destination was a newly formed shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. It was a classic textbook asset stripping maneuver designed to completely drain an elderly person's life savings with zero paper trail. But what made my blood run entirely cold was the authorization log. The request to release the funds had not been submitted days ago. The digital signature was time-stamped exactly 15 minutes ago, and the digital notary stamp attached to the transfer belonged to Marcus. While he was sitting there laughing at me and adjusting his expensive cufflinks, he was actively executing a massive financial crime right under my nose. My grandmother was not incapacitated. She knew exactly what they were doing to her, and she had used this dinner as her only chance to pass me the information. They thought they had time. They thought they had executed the perfect crime against a helpless old woman while I sat silently and took their abuse. They profoundly underestimated the daughter they had spent a decade treating like garbage. I did not bother returning to the dining room. I tapped the screen and initiated a hard federal freeze on the asset pipeline. Then I pulled up a secure contact on my phone and hit dial. I needed local uniforms at my parents' house immediately. The perfect family facade was about to shatter, and I was the one holding the hammer. The air in the private dining room was thick with the smell of roasted meat and my mother's suffocating perfume. I sat perfectly still, letting the insults from my father and my sister wash over me. I was trained to endure high-pressure interrogations, so a family dinner was nothing but a minor inconvenience. But my focus shifted when the woman sitting directly to my right let out a soft, wheezing breath. My grandmother Claire was 82 years old. For the past 2 years, my parents had convinced everyone in our affluent circle that she was rapidly declining from severe dementia. They moved her into their massive estate, claiming she needed constant medical care and supervision. Tonight they had propped her up in a chair at the end of the table like a discarded mannequin. She wore a blank, vacant expression. A small amount of water had spilled down the front of her expensive silk blouse, and no one had even bothered to hand her a napkin. My parents and Harper spoke over her as if she were completely deaf. Marcus did not even look in her direction, treating her like she was already invisible. I reached my left hand under the heavy white tablecloth, intending to grab my purse and retrieve a credit card tied to my civilian cover identity. I just wanted to pay the ridiculous dinner bill and get out of there. But as my fingers brushed past my grandmother's lap, the illusion of her fragile, helpless state completely shattered. Beneath the table, completely hidden from the view of my laughing, arrogant family, Claire's hand shot out with terrifying speed. Her grip was like a steel trap. Her cold, bony fingers clamped around my wrist with a sudden, brutal strength that nearly made me gasp out loud. I froze completely. The physical power in her hand was absolutely impossible for a woman who was supposedly wasting away. I slowly turned my head to look at her. Her face had not changed at all. She still wore that exact same vacant, lost stare. Her eyes were fixed blankly on the floral centerpiece in the middle of the table. Her jaw was slightly slack, perfectly playing the part of a woman whose mind was entirely gone. But beneath the tablecloth, her thumb was pressing desperately hard into my pulse point. It was a grounding gesture, a silent command demanding my absolute attention. She slowly opened her palm, revealing a crumpled white cocktail napkin. With agonizing, deliberate care, she slid the rough paper into my hand. The moment my fingers closed around it, she immediately let go. She let her hand drop limply back into her lap, and her chin dipped forward, resuming her flawless performance of a broken catatonic patient. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I kept my face entirely neutral, masking the massive shock that was rushing through my veins. Years of undercover federal training took over, allowing me to suppress any physical reaction. My grandmother did not have dementia. She was fully lucid. She was trapped inside a terrifying disguise, forced to play the part of a sick woman while surrounded by her own predatory family. And she had just risked everything to send me a message right under their noses. I slowly lowered my hands to my lap and unfolded the paper under the table, knowing that whatever was written inside was going to change everything. I stood up from the table. The wooden chair legs scraped loudly against the polished floor, drawing the immediate attention of everyone who was just sitting there, waiting for me to react to the absurd dinner bill. I kept my face entirely blank and my posture perfectly submissive. I excused myself, keeping my voice quiet, saying I just needed a moment to use the restroom. My father let out a harsh scoff that carried perfectly over the clinking crystal. He told the entire table I was probably running away from the check, just like I ran away from every other adult responsibility in my life. Harper laughed, her bright tinkling sound that always signaled her absolute victory. I did not look back. I just kept walking until the heavy oak doors of the private dining room closed behind me, cutting off the sound of their cruel amusement. The hallway leading to the restrooms was lined with expensive artwork and dim, flattering lighting designed to make wealthy patrons feel comfortable. I pushed through the heavy door into the women's lounge, ensuring it was completely empty before I walked over to the marble sink. The air smelled of expensive jasmine soap and unearned entitlement. I leaned against the cold stone counter and slowly opened my hand. I flattened the crumpled white linen against the marble. My grandmother had always possessed beautiful, precise penmanship. The ink on the napkin was slightly shaky, betraying her 82 years and whatever immense stress she was currently enduring. But the numbers were deliberate and exact. It was a 9-digit bank routing number, followed by an offshore account prefix that I recognized immediately from my federal cases. It was a Cayman Islands routing code. Beneath those meticulously written digits was a single frantically underlined word: help. I stared at that word, and in that exact second, the helpless, unemployed daughter my family loved to mock ceased to exist. I did not panic. I reached into the hidden inner pocket of my simple gray blazer and pulled out a heavy, matte black smartphone. It was not a standard consumer device. It was a heavily encrypted government-issued terminal linked directly to federal servers. My fingers flew across the encrypted screen of my device. I bypassed 3 layers of biometric security and logged directly into the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, secure database, right there in the bathroom of the steakhouse. The stark blue and white interface of the federal tracking system illuminated the small tiled space. I entered the routing number my grandmother had managed to slip me. The system spun for a few agonizing seconds, running rapid cross-checks through international banking protocols. When the results populated on my screen, all the breath left my lungs. I was looking at a live, active wire transfer. The numbers glowed in harsh white text. $3.8 million was currently in the process of being drained from my grandmother's irrevocable trust account. I tapped the screen, drilling down into the transaction details. The destination was a newly formed shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. It was a classic textbook asset stripping maneuver designed to completely drain an elderly person's life savings while leaving absolutely no paper trail for local authorities to follow. But I was not local authority. I had access to the architecture of the global banking system. I checked the authorization logs. The request to release the $3.8 million had not been submitted days or weeks ago. The digital signature and the corresponding notary stamp were time-stamped exactly 15 minutes ago. I stared at the name attached to the digital notary seal, Marcus Sterling. While my mother was drinking an expensive bottle of wine, while my sister was bragging about her wellness brand, while my father was sneering at my plain blazer, a massive financial crime was actively taking place right under my nose. Marcus was sitting out there in his flawless, custom-tailored suit, laughing at my supposed poverty while executing a live wire fraud to rob my grandmother blind. The implications slammed into me with sickening clarity. My grandmother knew exactly what was happening to her money. She had somehow managed to memorize the routing number of the account they were using to steal from her. I stared at the pending transfer status. The funds were currently in a holding pattern waiting for final international clearance. They thought they had time. They thought they had executed the perfect crime while I sat silently and took their abuse. I did not bother returning to the dining room. I tapped the screen and initiated a hard federal freeze on the asset pipeline. Then I pulled up a secure contact on my phone and hit dial. It was time to go to war. I did not wait for my family to finish their expensive wine. I walked straight out the front doors of the steakhouse and flagged down a taxi. As the city lights blurred past the window, I dialed Detective Miller. He was a local law enforcement officer I had worked with on a massive embezzlement case 2 years ago. He knew exactly what I did for a living and the level of authority I carried. I gave him my parents' address and told him we had a live elder exploitation case. I needed uniforms on the ground immediately. I was going to pull my grandmother out of that house tonight. When my taxi pulled up to the wrought iron gates of my parents' sprawling suburban estate, Miller's unmarked sedan was already there, along with 2 black and white squad cars. The red and blue lights cut violently through the manicured darkness of the wealthy neighborhood. Miller gave me a quick nod as I stepped out into the crisp night air. I felt a surge of absolute certainty. We had beaten them home. My parents were still at the restaurant, and we were going to extract my grandmother before they even realized what hit them. We marched up the long flagstone driveway, and Miller hammered his heavy fist against the solid oak front door. But the door did not stay closed. It swung open almost immediately, and standing there bathed in the warm glow of the foyer chandelier were my father William and my mother Victoria. They had not stayed for dessert. They must have left the restaurant right after I slipped out. I expected to see terror on their faces. I expected my mother to start screaming and my father to cower at the sight of the local police. Instead, William leaned against the doorframe and let out a soft, amused chuckle. He looked at the flashing police lights and then looked down at me with an expression of supreme, arrogant satisfaction. Victoria stood right behind him, sipping from a crystal glass of sparkling water. She did not look like a woman who had just been caught committing a federal crime. She looked incredibly bored. "What is this?" Chloe, my father asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Did you seriously call the police to our home because you were upset about paying for dinner? You really have lost your mind." I ignored his pathetic attempt at gaslighting. I stepped forward, my voice hard and uncompromising. "We are executing a wellness check on Claire Adams," I stated, looking right past him into the massive, silent house. "Step aside, William." Detective Miller placed his hand firmly on his utility belt, echoing my command. "Sir, we need to see the elderly woman residing in this house immediately." My father did not flinch. He did not step back. He actually smiled. It was a cold, vicious smile that made my stomach drop. He casually stepped aside, gesturing for us to enter the grand foyer. "By all means," Officer Williams said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Search the house. Search every single room if you want to." I pushed past him, my heart pounding with sudden dread. I marched straight up the sweeping mahogany staircase and hurried down the long hallway toward the guest suite where they kept my grandmother. I threw the heavy oak door open, ready to tell her she was finally safe. But the breath caught in my throat. I stopped dead in the doorway. The room was completely bare. The hospital bed was gone. The medical equipment was gone. The expensive rugs had been rolled up and removed. The room echoed with a hollow, terrifying emptiness. My grandmother was not there. I spun around to find my parents standing at the end of the hallway, watching me with triumphant, malicious grins. They had anticipated my move. I thought I was walking in to save her, but I had walked right into a brick wall. I stood frozen in the doorway of the empty guest room, my blood running cold as my parents' triumphant smiles widened. Before I could demand to know where she was, a slow, deliberate footstep echoed down the long hallway. Marcus stepped out from the shadows of the master study. He had not even taken off his suit jacket. He looked completely unbothered, adjusting his diamond cufflinks with the relaxed elegance of a man who held all the cards. He walked toward us, his expensive leather shoes completely silent against the hardwood floor. He did not look angry. He looked at me with the mild disappointment of a wealthy man dealing with an unruly servant. "Chloe, you really are making a scene," Marcus said, his deep, smooth voice cutting through the tension. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal documents. He did not hand them to me. He handed them directly to Detective Miller. "I believe this will clear up any confusion, officers," Marcus stated politely. "What you are looking at is an expedited state court order for an emergency medical conservatorship. signed and sealed by a state Supreme Court judge just this morning. I stepped forward trying to snatch the papers, but Miller held up his hand, his expression suddenly grim as he scanned the top page. I looked over the detective's shoulder and felt a sickening wave of revulsion. It was exactly like the oppressive conservatorships used to trap vulnerable heiresses. The document claimed my grandmother was a severe physical danger to herself and others. Attached to the back was a sworn psychiatric evaluation signed by a private doctor declaring her completely incompetent and legally stripping her of all her civil rights. Claire was transported to the Oakwood Pines Psychiatric Center during dinner. Marcus explained, his tone dripping with fake manufactured sympathy. It is a highly secure lockdown facility. The doctors there specialize in aggressive dementia patients. She is finally getting the absolute confinement she desperately needs. I had orchestrated the entire thing. The polished venture capitalist had used his vast shadow network to secure a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation and push it through the local courts with lightning speed. He knew the local police could not simply ignore a state judge's signature. I was weaponizing the legal system to hold my grandmother hostage. Detective Miller lowered the documents. His jaw was clenched tight, but I could see the professional hesitation in his eyes. A state court order was an absolute brick wall for local law enforcement. Miller looked at me and shook his head slightly. Without a warrant or a higher jurisdiction, local police could not break a state judge's medical mandate. Marcus knew this exactly. He was using the privilege and bureaucratic red tape of the wealthy elite to completely paralyze the local cops. My father, William, puffed out his chest, entirely emboldened by the detective's hesitation. "You heard him, officer," my father barked, his voice regaining its booming, arrogant volume. "We have full legal custody over that sick old woman. Chloe has absolutely no authority here. She is an unstable, unemployed girl throwing a tantrum because we cut off her allowance." Victoria stepped up beside him, crossing her arms tightly. "I want her out of my house immediately," she demanded, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "She is trespassing. If you do not remove her right now, I am pressing charges for breaking and entering." Marcus smiled, a cold, victorious smile that did not reach his eyes. "It is time for you to go home, Chloe," he said softly. "Leave the real world to the adults." They thought they had won. They thought they had used their expensive lawyers and fake medical documents to completely outmaneuver me. They thought I was just going to walk out the front door and cry in my cheap apartment. I looked at Marcus and then at my parents. I did not scream. I did not fight them. I simply turned around and walked down the sweeping staircase with the officers. Let them enjoy their fake victory tonight, because they had no idea I was about to bring the full, terrifying weight of the federal government crashing down on their heads. I walked down the stone driveway with Detective Miller. The heavy front door of my parents' house slammed shut behind us, echoing in the quiet suburban night. Miller let out a heavy sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked at me with genuine regret. "I am sorry, Chloe," he said, his voice low. "A state Supreme Court order is ironclad for local patrol. I cannot breach that house or track down your grandmother without a higher warrant. My hands are completely tied." I stopped walking. The flashing red and blue lights of the squad cars illuminated the cold fury settling in my chest. I turned to face the detective. I did not shed a single tear. I did not look defeated. I reached into the hidden breast pocket of my blazer and pulled out a solid black leather case. With a sharp flick of my wrist, I opened it. The solid gold shield of the United States Treasury Department caught the harsh glare of the police lights. Right below it was my federal identification card, clearly displaying my title as Senior Forensic Investigator for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Detective Miller stared at the gold badge. His eyes went incredibly wide. He looked from the federal seal up to my face, trying to process the fact that the unemployed woman he thought he was helping was actually a high-ranking federal agent. "Your hands are tied by a state order, Miller," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "But mine are not. A live international wire fraud investigation triggers a federal override. And under the Bank Secrecy Act, I am declaring my grandmother a protected material witness in a federal racketeering case that completely supersedes their fake state paperwork. I need your tactical gear, and I need a federal strike team at Oakwood Pines Psychiatric Center in 20 minutes. Miller's shock melted away, instantly replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. He did not ask questions. He simply nodded and grabbed his radio. 20 minutes later, we arrived at the massive iron gates of Oakwood Pines. The facility sat isolated at the end of a heavily wooded road, looking more like a maximum security prison than a medical clinic. 3 black armored federal SUVs rolled up right behind Miller's sedan. 8 heavily armed tactical agents poured out of the vehicles, their boots hitting the pavement with terrifying synchronized precision. We marched straight up to the main entrance. The thick reinforced glass doors were locked shut. A smug night director stood behind the glass holding a clipboard. He looked at our tactical vests and shook his head, shouting through the intercom that we had no jurisdiction over a private medical lockdown. He held up a copy of Marcus' fake conservatorship and tapped the glass arrogantly, expecting us to turn around and walk away. I did not waste a single second arguing. I looked at the lead tactical agent and gave a single sharp nod. The agent stepped forward, raised a heavy steel breaching ram, and slammed it directly into the center of the reinforced door. The impact sounded like an explosion. The shatterproof glass spiderwebbed instantly. A second brutal strike shattered it completely, sending a massive wave of broken glass crashing across the sterile lobby floor. The night director shrieked and dropped his clipboard, stumbling backward in absolute unadulterated terror. I stepped right through the shattered door frame, the glass crunching violently beneath my practical shoes. The federal strike team flooded the lobby, fanning out and securing every hallway in a matter of seconds. I walked directly up to the trembling director and shoved my gold federal shield right into his face. "I am Agent Chloe Adams," I commanded, my voice echoing sharply off the sterile walls. "You are currently holding a federal witness hostage under fraudulent medical pretenses. If you do not take me to Claire Adams right this exact second, I will have you chained to a radiator in a federal holding cell for obstruction of justice." The director was shaking so hard he could barely speak. He fumbled frantically for his master keycard and pointed a trembling finger toward the maximum security wing. The legal games were over, and I was taking my grandmother back. We drove in absolute silence through the dark city streets until my armored vehicle pulled into the subterranean garage of my secure downtown loft. It was a digital fortress equipped with retinal scanners and a dedicated encrypted server rack humming quietly in the corner. I guided my grandmother into the living room and draped a thick wool blanket over her shoulders. The adrenaline of the raid was beginning to wear off, but as I turned to hand her a glass of water, I froze. My grandmother was not slouching. She was not staring blankly at the wall. She was sitting perfectly straight, her posture commanding and elegant, despite the terrible hospital gown she was wearing beneath her coat. The vacant, confused fog that had clouded her expression for 2 long years was completely gone. Her eyes met mine. They were razor-sharp, fiercely intelligent, and entirely lucid. "You took your time getting that badge, Chloe," she said, her voice crystal clear and perfectly steady. I stood there staring at her in absolute awe. "You do not have dementia," I breathed. "Not a single trace," she replied coolly. "But if I did not play the part, your mother would have heavily medicated me into a real coma months ago. I needed them to get greedy enough to make a fatal mistake." My grandmother reached up to the heavy woolen cardigan she was wearing. Her fingers worked expertly at a large, ornate black button near the collar. With a sharp twist, the front of the button snapped off, revealing a hollow cavity inside. She pulled out a tiny silver micro-memory card and held it out to me. "They did not just try to take my cash, Chloe," she whispered, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "They were running a massive syndicate right out of the guest room. This drive proves exactly how they plan to do it." I took the tiny drive from her trembling fingers. The cool metal felt heavy with the weight of a dozen different federal felonies. I walked over to my primary workstation, which looked like the inside of a federal surveillance van, with massive monitors arranged above a reinforced steel desk. I slid the drive into a highly secure isolated port and ran the decryption software. The massive screens flickered to life. The hidden camera my grandmother had secretly installed offered a perfect, unobstructed view of her guest suite. I watched the digital version of Claire sitting in her armchair perfectly still. The heavy oak door swung open, and my mother Victoria marched into the room carrying a tray with a single cup of tea. Victoria did not look like the polished, respectable suburbanite she played for her wealthy friends. Her face was contorted in an ugly, vicious sneer. I watched in absolute horror as my mother pulled a small plastic bottle from her pocket. She crushed 3 heavy sedatives into a fine powder and dumped them directly into my grandmother's tea. "Drink it!" Victoria hissed violently, shoving the cup against my grandmother's lips. "If you do not drink this right now, I will have you strapped to a bed in a state-run asylum where no one will ever find you." I felt my hands ball into tight fists. My own mother was actively poisoning her mother-in-law to keep her docile and confused. But the horror show was not over. The heavy door in the video opened a second time and Marcus stepped into the frame. The supposedly aristocratic venture capitalist was not acting like a polite society heir. He was acting like a cartel boss. He walked into the room adjusting his expensive silk tie and looked at my father William, who was cowering in the corner. "You are moving too slow." William Marcus snapped, his voice sharp and commanding. The charming accent was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating menace. "The offshore accounts are fully primed and waiting. You need to force her to sign the final trust release by tomorrow." My father actually flinched, shrinking back like a reprimanded schoolboy. "I am trying," Marcus Williams stammered, sweating profusely. "She is just being difficult. We are running out of time." Marcus stepped forward, grabbing my father by the collar of his expensive suit. "Listen to me very carefully," Marcus whispered dangerously. "The international transfer window is incredibly tight. We are washing the entire $3.8 million directly through Harper's cosmetic company. We are going to make it look like international wholesale inventory revenue. If those funds are not moving through your daughter's fake wellness brand by Thursday at midnight, the entire shell structure collapses. And if it collapses, William, my employers will kill you and your entire family." The video abruptly cut to black. The sudden silence in my safe house was deafening. I stared at the blank monitor as the pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying precision. Harper's highly publicized wellness brand was not a legitimate business. It was a sophisticated money laundering front designed to wash my grandmother's stolen millions. Marcus was a high-level fixer moving illicit cash for a global shadow network, and the absolute deadline was Thursday at midnight. I checked the digital clock on my wall. It was currently Tuesday morning. I had exactly 36 hours before Marcus pulled the trigger on a massive international laundering operation that would permanently erase my grandmother's wealth and leave my entire family holding the bag for a federal syndicate. The sun had barely breached the horizon, casting a cold gray light across the industrial windows of my loft when the relentless vibrating began. My civilian phone, discarded on the glass coffee table hours ago, was rattling so violently it threatened to slide right off the edge. I ignored it at first, keeping my eyes locked on the federal terminal to ensure the evidence files were fully backed up. But the buzzing did not stop. I walked over and picked up the device. The lock screen was completely buried under a torrential avalanche of notifications. There were hundreds of missed calls, thousands of text messages, and an endless stream of social media alerts. A message from a distant cousin sat at the very top, containing a single video link and a text that read, "You are a complete monster." I tapped the link. The application opened, and Harper's face filled the screen. She was sitting in the immaculate marble kitchen of her penthouse. The heavy, glamorous makeup she usually wore for her brand deals was entirely gone, replaced by a carefully curated look of raw, vulnerable exhaustion. She wore an oversized beige sweater that made her look incredibly fragile. Her eyes were red-rimmed and she was clutching a crumpled tissue. It was the performance of a lifetime engineered for maximum viral sympathy. Harper looked directly into the camera lens with wide, pleading eyes and began to cry. She told her millions of followers that her family was living a nightmare. She claimed her older sister Chloe had been struggling with severe, untreated mental health issues for years. She painted a horrifying picture, telling the internet that I had broken into a specialized medical facility and abducted our beloved sick grandmother. Harper sobbed perfectly on cue, claiming I was an unstable, unemployed failure holding a helpless elderly woman for ransom because of my severe financial problems. She begged her massive audience to help find me and bring her grandmother home safely. The video had been posted less than 2 hours ago and already had 5 million views. I scrolled down to the comments section. It was a digital lynch mob. Harper had successfully weaponized her massive wellness army against me. The comments were a horrific tidal wave of blind hatred. Thousands of strangers were demanding my immediate arrest. They were coordinating efforts to find my address and hacking into public records to dox my location. Some were posting graphic death threats, declaring they would personally hunt me down and burn my apartment to the ground to save my grandmother. My own extended family members, who had ignored me for a decade, were suddenly flooding my inbox, calling me a psychopath and a thief. But the digital assault was not their only weapon. As I watched the hate comments multiply, a harsh red banner dropped down across my phone screen. It was an automated high-priority alert from my civilian bank. I tapped the notification and watched my checking and savings account balances drop instantly to a solid string of zeros. The accounts were locked pending legal review. My father William was moving fast. He had used the fraudulent state conservatorship and his expensive corporate lawyers to legally freeze my local assets. I was trying to squeeze me out. He thought I was entirely dependent on the few $1,000s I kept in those accounts for groceries and rent. He believed he was cutting off my oxygen to force my surrender before the Thursday midnight deadline. My phone vibrated again with a direct text message from William. It read, "Bring your grandmother home, or you will not have a single dime to eat. You cannot fight my lawyers, Chloe." I looked at the threatening message and let out a genuine, unburdened laugh. They thought public humiliation and a frozen civilian bank account would break me. They had absolutely no idea that my civilian identity was just a prop and my real wealth was securely held in encrypted federal trust accounts they could never even locate, let alone freeze. Let them scream on the internet. I was preparing a much louder response. I tossed my civilian phone onto the couch and turned back to my federal terminal. I needed to finish packaging the digital evidence for the prosecutor. But before my fingers even touched the keyboard, my primary monitor flickered violently. A harsh line of static ripped across the screen. The progress bar for my evidence upload froze completely. I frowned and ran a rapid diagnostic check. Before I could enter a single command, all 4 of my monitors flashed a blinding red. The cooling fans in my server rack spun up to a deafening roar. A massive brute force cyber attack had just slammed into my loft's local network. Marcus and his shadow syndicate had detected my digital footprint. They knew someone was digging into the back end of their offshore pipelines, and they were lashing out aggressively, trying to wipe my servers before I could secure the evidence. I grabbed my encrypted radio and called David, my closest friend and the top cybersecurity architect for our agency. He was already monitoring the network from headquarters. "I need a digital perimeter right now," I shouted over the roar of the servers. "They are trying to breach the mainframe." David did not waste a second. "I hear you, Chloe," he replied, his voice sharp and focused. "They are hitting you with a massive coordinated attack. It is cartel-level architecture. I am routing your incoming traffic through a decoy server farm in Eastern Europe. Lock down your physical ports." My fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating the lockdown protocols. The heat in the room spiked as my servers fought to process the overwhelming flood of malicious traffic. For 5 agonizing minutes, it was a brutal digital war. We traded countermeasures, reinforcing firewalls and blocking invasive scripts. Finally, the red warning lights on my screens shifted back to a stable blue. The attack bounced off our federal encryption and dissolved into the decoy servers. We had won the battle. But in their desperate panic to destroy my data, Marcus had made a fatal error. He left a microscopic digital footprint in the server logs. "Chloe, look at this," David said, his voice tight with shock as he pushed a new file to my terminal. I traced the origin of the attack. It bounced through a highly sophisticated proxy network. I followed the routing data backward and cracked the central node. Look at the real profile for Marcus Sterling. I opened the classified dossier David sent. I stared at the raw data, and the terrifying reality of my sister's fiancé was finally laid bare. Marcus Sterling, the polished, wealthy venture capitalist, did not exist. The entire identity was a complete fabrication manufactured out of thin air. He was a high-tier financial fixer, a ghost who specialized in erasing money trails for international cartels. He did not target innocent people. He targeted wealthy, morally corrupt families who were too arrogant to notice the red flags. Marcus had selected my family with clinical precision. He saw my father's insatiable greed and my mother's obsession with status. And most importantly, he saw Harper. Harper was not a brilliant businesswoman. She was a clueless, fame-hungry narcissist completely blinded by Marcus and his fake wealth. She was the perfect puppet. I looked at the offshore routing map David had unspooled on the screen. Marcus was using Harper's cosmetic company as the sole digital washing machine for the syndicate's dirty money. But the most chilling part was the exit protocol. David highlighted the wire transfer scheduled for Thursday at midnight. "This is a kill switch," David whispered. I stared at the intricate web of dummy accounts. Thursday at midnight was not just a transfer. It was the end of the line. The digital script attached to the money was designed to automatically trigger a massive data wipe across the syndicate servers, the exact millisecond the funds cleared the final offshore checkpoint. It was programmed to erase every single trace of Marcus and his involvement. I was going to take the $3.8 million and vanish into thin air. But he was leaving the domestic architecture entirely intact. The federal auditors would not see a ghost syndicate. They would see Harper's signature on the forged corporate ledgers. They would see my father's name on the fraudulent conservatorship documents. They would see my mother authorizing the medical neglect. Marcus was going to take a private jet to a non-extradition country and leave my entire family holding the bag for a massive federal crime. My parents and my sister were going to spend the rest of their natural lives in federal prison, while the man they worshipped walked away rich and completely untraceable. I stared at the federal monitors, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. My family was blindly marching toward their own absolute destruction, completely unaware that the man they worshipped was planning to leave them to rot in a federal prison. But before I could fully process the sickening irony of their situation, a sharp chime echoed from my civilian phone. I walked over to the couch and picked up the device. Through the endless barrage of death threats and hateful comments from Harper's unhinged followers, a formal email had broken through the noise. It was from the elite high-powered law firm representing my father. I opened the attachment. It was a mandatory emergency subpoena for pretrial mediation regarding the family court conservatorship. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning at their downtown luxury offices. Right as I finished reading the legal threat, my screen flashed with a new direct text message from William. He was not waiting for the lawyers to do the talking. He wanted to twist the knife himself. He wanted to assert his absolute dominance over the daughter he viewed as a pathetic failure. I opened the message and read his arrogant words. "Bring your grandmother to the law firm tomorrow morning," he demanded. "You are going to get on your knees and apologize to your sister on a live broadcast. You will tell the entire world that you are mentally unstable and that Harper is a saint for forgiving you. If you do exactly as I say, I will tell my lawyers to unlock your bank cards so you can buy yourself some food. Otherwise, you can rot in a jail cell and starve." The sheer audacity of his ultimatum hung in the quiet air of my loft. He truly believed he had broken me. He thought the frozen checking account and the vicious internet mob had brought me to my absolute knees. He believed I was a terrified, broke, and desperate woman who would gladly trade her dignity and her grandmother's safety for a few $100s to buy groceries. He wanted to look me in the eye and watch me surrender in a room full of expensive lawyers. I looked at the text message, feeling a sharp, predatory calm wash over my entire body. If I sent a federal strike team to their suburban estate right now, Marcus would run. He was a professional ghost. The second he smelled federal agents approaching the property, he would activate a burner protocol and vanish before we could even secure the perimeter. I could not risk losing the architect of the entire syndicate. I needed him contained. I needed all of them in one highly secure room with absolutely zero escape routes. To do that, I needed to feed my father's monumental ego. I needed to give him exactly what he wanted so he would blindly walk right into the federal trap I was setting. I tapped the digital keyboard on my phone, crafting a response of deliberate, calculated submission. I typed out 2 short sentences. "You win. I will bring her to the mediation tomorrow." I hit send. The loft was quiet as I waited, the tension in the air thick and electric. Less than 30 seconds later, my screen illuminated with his immediate reply. He had taken the bait completely. His response was laced with the suffocating, arrogant cruelty that had defined his entire existence as a father. "Good girl," William wrote. "Know your place." I locked my phone screen and set it down on the glass table. I looked over at my grandmother, who was sitting quietly in the armchair sipping a fresh cup of tea. She met my gaze and gave me a firm, uncompromising nod. She was ready. They thought the game was over. They thought they had backed a helpless, unemployed girl into a corner. They had absolutely no idea that tomorrow morning I was going to walk into a room full of expensive lawyers and arrogant criminals, and I was going to burn their entire world to the ground. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the horrific ultimatum my father had just sent. He wanted me to grovel. He wanted me to record a live apology begging for my sister's forgiveness, just so he would unfreeze a checking account that held a few $1,000s. I let out a slow, steady breath. The urge to call him and unleash the full, terrifying weight of my federal authority was strong, but I pushed it down. If I showed my hand right now, they would panic. Marcus would sense the danger and disappear onto a private jet before I could even dispatch a tactical team. I needed them confident. I needed them completely drunk on their own arrogance. So instead of fighting back, I decided to give them the ultimate fake victory. I tapped the glass screen of my phone and typed a simple message of total submission. I give up. I will bring Grandma to the mediation tomorrow. I hit send and set the phone face up on the glass table. The response came back almost instantly. The screen lit up with a message from William. I could practically see the smug, victorious smirk plastered across his face as he typed it. Finally, he wrote, "It is about time you realized you cannot survive without us. Be there at 9 sharp and wear something presentable for once. Do not embarrass us in front of the lawyers." I read the text, and a cold, clinical smile touched my lips. They were celebrating. Right at that very moment in their sprawling suburban mansion, William, Victoria, Harper, and Marcus were probably raising glasses of expensive champagne. They thought they had successfully crushed the rebellious, unemployed daughter. They thought their $3.8 million money laundering scheme was perfectly safe. They were utterly convinced that tomorrow morning I would walk into that law firm defeated and broken, handing over the only witness to their crimes. They had no idea I was not coming to apologize. I was coming to execute a federal raid. I picked up my encrypted terminal and opened a direct line to Detective Miller and my cybersecurity team. "The trap is set," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet loft. They took the bait. "I need a full tactical perimeter around the Crawford and Sterling law firm by 8:30 tomorrow morning. I want all building exits locked down and the private elevators controlled by federal agents." "Understood," Chloe Miller replied, his tone sharp and ready. "We will have a strike team in the lobby and agents stationed on their floor. No one goes in or out without your direct authorization." I closed the connection and turned to my grandmother. She was watching me from the couch, her eyes bright and entirely fearless. She had heard every word. "We are going to mediation," I told her gently. "Are you ready to see them one last time?" My grandmother straightened her posture, resting her hands in her lap. "Let them think they have won," she said, her voice completely steady. "The higher they fly, the harder they will hit the concrete." I nodded and turned back to my federal monitors to finalize the massive indictment dossier. The agonizing 9 years of playing the family scapegoat were officially over. Tomorrow morning, the helpless daughter they loved to mock was going to walk into that boardroom and permanently erase their entire criminal empire. The morning sun glared off the towering glass walls of the Crawford and Sterling law firm. I stepped out of the private elevator onto the 40th floor. The entire space was a monument to corporate intimidation, designed to make anyone who walked inside feel completely powerless. But as I walked down the marble hallway, I did not feel small. I felt like an apex predator stepping willingly into a cage full of oblivious mice. The heavy double doors of the mediation suite stood wide open. I stepped over the threshold into a massive room featuring a sprawling oak conference table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. My family had turned out in full force for what they clearly believed was going to be my public execution. My father, William, sat dead center at the head of the table wearing a custom-tailored navy suit. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair with a posture of absolute unearned victory, projecting the aura of a benevolent king, ready to pardon a treasonous peasant. Beside him, my mother, Victoria, wore a tight, highly practiced mask of maternal concern, though her eyes gleamed with vicious, malicious triumph. They looked at me with smug, satisfied smirks. Harper sat directly across from them, wearing a stark white designer dress. She glared at me, sliding a thick packet of stapled paper across the smooth oak table. It was a strict non-disclosure agreement and a forced surrender of custody. She had her phone resting on a tripod nearby, completely ready to hit record the moment I fell to my knees and delivered my forced, tearful apology to her millions of followers. Next to Harper sat Marcus. The supposedly aristocratic venture capitalist looked entirely bored by the family drama. He sat with his long legs elegantly crossed, idly tapping his manicured fingers against the polished wood. He checked his diamond-encrusted watch, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He was counting down the hours. He was sitting in a room full of people he was planning to permanently ruin, just waiting for the midnight wire transfer to clear so he could vanish with $3.8 million. His performance was an absolute masterpiece of sociopathic deception. At the far end of the long table sat the court-appointed mediator. He was a stern, bossy retired judge known for his strict, uncompromising adherence to family court protocols. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked down his nose at me with a heavy sigh, clearly annoyed by my plain black blazer and my lack of a designer handbag. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, sealing us inside the glass suite. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against the walls. They were all staring at me. They were waiting for my voice to crack. They were waiting for me to cry and beg for their forgiveness so I could afford to buy groceries. They were waiting for the helpless, unemployed daughter to finally surrender. I walked to the single empty chair left for me at the opposite end of the table and placed my plain black briefcase on the polished oak. I did not sit down. My father William leaned forward, placing his hands on the table, ready to deliver his final condescending speech. He opened his mouth to demand my apology, but I did not let him speak a single syllable. I reached down and unlatched the brass clasps of my plain black briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like gunshots in the dead silent room. I reached inside and pulled out a single massive heavy dossier. It was bound in thick federal stock paper and secured with heavy brass brackets. Stamped right in the center of the cover was the unmistakable bright red insignia of the United States Treasury Department. I placed my hand flat on top of the file and shoved it hard down the center of the oak table. It glided smoothly past Harper's pathetic non-disclosure agreement, past my father's smug face, and came to a sudden stop directly in front of the court-appointed mediator. I sat back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap. The retired judge frowned deeply, clearly annoyed by my lack of submission and this sudden breach of mediation protocol. He adjusted his reading glasses and pulled the heavy file closer. He opened the thick cover. I watched the exact moment the seasoned legal veteran realized what he was actually looking at. The mild, arrogant irritation vanished from his eyes, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. I saw the official red seals of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. He saw the classified offshore routing numbers, the wire fraud allegations, and the undeniable documentation of an international money-laundering syndicate linked directly to the wealthy family sitting in his room. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His hands actually began to tremble as he flipped past the first page of the summary brief. He looked up, his eyes wide and panicked, staring directly at my father. He shoved his leather chair back so violently it nearly tipped over onto the marble floor. "I have absolutely no jurisdiction here," the judge stammered, his voice breathless and hollow, cracking the tense silence of the room. "These are federal criminal dockets. This is a federal racketeering and wire fraud indictment." The judge frantically grabbed his own briefcase, completely ignoring my father's confused shouts. "I am officially withdrawing as the mediator effective immediately," the judge announced, his voice pitching upward in pure panic. "I will not have my name or my firm attached to a federal crime." He did not wait for a single response. He turned and practically sprinted out of the glass suite, leaving the heavy oak doors swinging open behind him. The arrogant legal shield my family had relied on evaporated in less than 30 seconds, leaving them sitting in a state of stunned, paralyzed confusion. My father stared at the empty doorway where the judge had just fled. He turned back to me, his face flushing with a mixture of confused panic and boiling anger. He slammed his fist down on the polished oak table, trying desperately to regain control of the room. He pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that I was a complete psychopath. He claimed I had printed fake government documents from the internet just to scare them. He told me I was going to jail for extortion and that he would never unfreeze my checking account. Before my father could finish his pathetic empty threats, the heavy oak doors were shoved open with violent, unexpected force. The loud crash silenced the entire room instantly. Detective Miller strode into the luxury suite wearing a dark tactical vest over his uniform. Flanking him were 4 heavily armed FBI tactical agents. They moved with absolute uncompromising precision, fanning out across the room. 2 agents physically blocked the main double doors, while the others secured the perimeter near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Their hands rested casually on their holstered weapons, and their eyes scanned my family with cold professional detachment. My mother, Victoria, let out a high-pitched shriek, pressing her hands against her mouth. Harper froze, completely, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. Even Marcus, the unflappable syndicate fixer, stiffened in his chair. I stood up from my seat. I did not slouch. I did not look down. I straightened my simple black blazer and let the fabricated, helpless, pathetic persona I had worn for 9 years evaporate into thin air. The invisible weight I had carried, the constant need to shrink myself to fit their toxic narrative was gone. I looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. "Allow me to formally introduce myself," I said, my voice projecting absolute, undeniable authority. "I am Chloe Adams. I am a senior forensic investigator for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, operating directly under the United States Treasury Department." The absolute horror that washed over my parents' faces was a masterpiece of human devastation. I watched their minds desperately try to process the information, watching the last 9 years of their lives recontextualize in real time. They suddenly realized I was never an unemployed failure. I was an apex predator, hunting international syndicates, and they had invited a massive financial crime ring right into their living room while I sat at their dinner table. My father gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning bone white. He opened his mouth, but his booming, arrogant voice was reduced to a pathetic stammer. "This is a trick." William choked out, his chest heaving. "You do not work for the government. You are broke, Chloe. You do not even have money for groceries. I froze your accounts." I looked at him with profound clinical pity. "The $3,000 you froze in that local checking account was a civilian decoy." I stated, my tone icy and exact. It was a fake financial profile designed to match the pathetic cover story I maintained for my investigations. For 9 years, my government contractor salary, my international hazard pay, and my federal bonuses have been routed directly into highly classified encrypted trusts. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the oak table. "I do not need your grocery money, William. My liquid assets are easily 100 times greater than your entire debt-ridden fake suburban estate. You tried to starve me out, but you just froze a puddle while I am sitting on an ocean." Marcus Sterling had stopped tapping his fingers against the table. The polished veneer of the wealthy venture capitalist completely vanished. He saw the federal tactical gear and calculated his odds. He suddenly shoved his heavy leather chair backward and lunged for the side door. He did not make it 2 steps. The federal agents moved with terrifying speed. One agent grabbed his expensive suit jacket, slamming him hard against the glass wall. The sickening crunch of Marcus hitting the glass echoed through the room as heavy steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists. I looked at the man my family worshipped. Then I turned to my parents and my sister, who were paralyzed with shock. "You really thought he was going to save your fake empire?" I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Marcus was never going to marry you, Harper. He is a syndicate fixer. And that wire transfer you all authorized for Thursday at midnight was a kill switch." I opened the federal dossier and spread the routing logs across the table. When that $3.8 million hit the Cayman accounts, it was programmed to trigger a massive data wipe. It was going to erase every trace of his existence. But he was leaving the domestic paper trail entirely intact. He was going to take the money and vanish, leaving your signatures on the fraudulent conservatorship, the fake medical evaluations, and the corporate laundering ledgers. He was setting you up to take the fall for a massive international crime while he disappeared on a private jet. The absolute staggering reality crashed down on my family. The illusion of their unbreakable upper-class loyalty shattered instantly. They were not a family. They were cornered rats. Victoria let out an animalistic shriek. She backed away from my father, pointing a shaking manicured finger at his face. "This is your fault," she screamed, her voice tearing through her throat. "You were bankrupt. You forced us into this because you were too much of a coward to admit you lost all our money. You made me drug your own mother." William turned completely purple with rage. He lunged toward his wife but stopped when an agent placed a hand on his weapon. "You greedy snake," William bellowed, spitting his words. "You wanted the country club memberships." "And Harper," he shouted, spinning to point at my sister. Harper signed the corporate ledgers. She washed the money through her fake company because she was desperate for cash. Arrest her. She is the mastermind. Harper stopped breathing. The golden child realized her father was eagerly throwing her to the federal wolves to save his own skin. Her pristine influencer mask melted away, revealing pure, unhinged malice. She let out a guttural scream and lunged across the polished oak table right at Marcus. She threw herself at the cuffed man, clawing at his face and tearing his expensive silk tie. "You ruined my life!" she shrieked hysterically as 2 federal agents grabbed her arms and dragged her backward. "You lied to me!" The luxurious mediation room had turned into a feral snake pit. They were screaming, crying, and tearing each other apart. The high society facade was entirely gone, exposing the cruel, cowardly, greedy core of their existence. Then the sharp snap of handcuffs silenced them. The agents secured William, Victoria, and Harper. The cold steel biting into their wrists finally brought them back to reality. The screaming stopped. They looked around the room, realizing their lawyers were gone and their lives were completely over. Driven by pure, desperate survival instinct, they turned to me. My father, the man who had mocked me for 9 years, lost complete control of his legs. He collapsed to his knees right there on the cold marble floor. My mother immediately followed, dropping down beside him, her mascara running in ugly dark rivers. "Chloe, please," my father begged, his voice reduced to a pathetic, reedy whine. "We are your family. We raised you. You have power in the government. You can fix this. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding." Victoria nodded frantically, crawling slightly forward. "We did it for the family, Chloe. We were trying to protect our legacy for you. Please do not let them take us away." I looked down at the 2 people who had given me life and the sister who had treated me like garbage. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a profound clinical emptiness. "You spent a decade treating me like a failure because I did not fit your fake plastic aesthetic," I said, my voice icy and final. "You poisoned an 82-year-old woman and tried to steal her life savings to fund your pathetic, hollow existence. You are not my family. You are simply closed case files." I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on their desperate sobbing and walked out the heavy oak doors, leaving them to the federal agents. 6 months evaporated like smoke, clearing the toxic fog that had suffocated my life for over a decade. I sat on the expansive leather sofa in my living room, nursing a cup of black coffee, while the morning news played on the flat-screen television. The anchor's voice was crisp and professional, delivering the final definitive epilogue to my family's legacy. The highly publicized influencer fraud ring had finally reached its judicial conclusion. The anchor announced that William and Victoria Adams, once prominent fixtures in the local Chicago social scene, were sentenced yesterday in federal court. They received 15 years in a federal penitentiary for conspiracy, massive wire fraud, and severe elder abuse. The screen flashed to courthouse footage from the previous afternoon. My parents were being led out of the building in handcuffs, surrounded by a swarm of hungry reporters. They looked entirely broken. My father had been stripped of his custom-tailored Navy suits and his country club arrogance. His shoulders were slumped and his face was pale. Beside him, my mother hid her face behind her shackled hands. Her designer clothes and expensive jewelry were gone, replaced by the stark, unforgiving reality of a federal prison uniform. They had turned on each other viciously during the trial, completely destroying the last remaining fragments of their marriage in a desperate failed attempt to save themselves. The news segment shifted to Marcus. The polished syndicate fixer received a much harsher fate. He was sentenced to 30 years in a maximum security federal lockdown with absolutely no possibility of early parole. The federal government seized all of his offshore accounts, leaving him with absolutely nothing. And then came Harper. My younger sister entirely avoided a massive prison sentence by eagerly turning state's evidence and testifying against our parents with a ruthless, self-serving desperation. But avoiding a cell did not mean she escaped punishment. The federal government seized her entire wellness brand, liquidating it as a criminal asset. Her bank accounts were drained to pay court-mandated restitution, and her luxury penthouse was foreclosed upon. The woman who had spent her entire life obsessed with her flawless digital image was forced into total bankruptcy. The ultimate poetic justice arrived a few days later on social media. The internet mob that Harper had weaponized against me completely turned on her. A local driver snapped a candid photo of her and posted it online, where it immediately went viral. In the photo, Harper was sitting inside a small concrete parking garage toll booth, working as a minimum wage cashier. Her heavy, glamorous makeup was gone, and her pristine designer dresses were replaced by a cheap synthetic uniform polo. She was staring blankly out of the booth, looking utterly miserable. She was trapped in the mundane, grueling reality she had spent her entire life mocking, forced to hand back change to the very people she used to look down upon. Her millions of followers were gone. Her manufactured prestige was completely dead. The karma was absolute. I hit the power button on the television, plunging the room into quiet, peaceful silence. I took a deep breath and let the absolute reality of my actual life wash over me. I was not sitting in the small, unassuming apartment I had used as my civilian cover for 9 years. I was standing in my real home. It was a sprawling, deeply secure, and stunning modern estate, hidden away in the dense, quiet woods just outside the city limits. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of ancient pine trees and a serene private lake. I had bought the property entirely in cash, using the classified federal salary my family was so utterly convinced did not exist. A gentle shuffling sound drew my attention toward the hallway. My grandmother Claire walked into the living room, relying lightly on a polished wooden cane. The transformation in her over the last 6 months was nothing short of miraculous. The hollow, terrified, over-medicated woman trapped in that sterile guest room was entirely gone. She was wearing a comfortable, elegant cashmere sweater, her silver hair perfectly styled. Her eyes were bright sharp and filled with a profound, undeniable joy. Her stolen assets had been fully restored by the federal recovery teams, but she did not care about the wealth. She cared that she was finally safe living in a beautiful, sunlit ground-floor suite in my home. "Happy Thanksgiving, Chloe," she said, her voice clear and strong. She walked over and placed a warm hand on my shoulder. "The house smells absolutely incredible." "Happy Thanksgiving, Grandma," I replied, smiling warmly. It was the very first holiday in my entire life that I did not wake up with a heavy, suffocating knot of dread twisting in my stomach. There would be no toxic relatives walking through my front door today. There would be no belittling comments about my wardrobe and no agonizing tension hanging over the dining table. Just before noon, the heavy security gates at the end of the long driveway hummed open. I watched through the window as a sleek black sedan pulled up to the front entrance. I opened the door to find David standing on the porch, holding 2 bottles of expensive red wine. He had stepped out of his encrypted cyber bunker, and a rare, genuine smile broke across his usually stoic face. 10 minutes later, Detective Miller arrived carrying a massive, freshly baked pecan pie. They were soon followed by 3 of my closest friends from the federal agency. These were the people who had treated me with absolute respect and kindness during my long undercover years when they thought I had nothing to my name. We gathered around the massive rustic farmhouse table in my dining room. The spread was magnificent, with a golden roasted turkey sitting in the center. There was no rigid, polished mahogany conference table designed to intimidate and isolate. We talked about real, meaningful things, sharing stories and laughing freely. I looked around the room at David, at Miller, and at my grandmother, who was smiling brighter than I had ever seen. This was my true, chosen family. We were not bound by the toxic obligations of blood or financial control. We were bound by mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and the shared unspoken understanding of what it actually meant to fight for the people you love. As I sat there looking at the people who actually cared about me, I finally understood the ultimate truth about vengeance. For 9 years, my parents and my sister tried to break my spirit. They wanted me to feel small so they could feel big. They wanted me to beg for their approval and their validation. When you grow up in a toxic environment, the natural instinct is always to fight back loudly. You want to scream your accomplishments from the rooftops, just to force them to finally see your value. But I learned the hard way that the greatest revenge is not screaming to prove your worth to people who are entirely committed to dragging you down. It is not matching their toxic energy or fighting for a seat at a table where you are not respected. The absolute best revenge is letting them underestimate you. It is letting them drown in their own arrogant, pathetic delusions. You let them believe they have won, while you quietly, methodically, and ruthlessly build an empire they could never even dream of touching. My family spent their entire lives chasing a fake plastic illusion of power, and it led them straight to a concrete prison cell. I spent my life building real quiet strength, and in the end, that silent, untouchable strength was all I needed to burn their toxic world to the ground while keeping my own completely safe. The story of what happened to my parents and sister serves as a powerful reminder that blood does not automatically dictate loyalty, love, or morality. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic relatives warm. True family members are the people who respect your boundaries, celebrate your genuine successes, and stand by you in your darkest moments without conditions or hidden agendas. Family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes family is the circle you build for yourself out of respect and unconditional support. Healing begins the moment you stop seeking approval from those who actively cause you pain and start investing that energy into your own peace. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build a life of your own, you know exactly how much courage that takes. I want to hear from you. Share your own stories of resilience, setting boundaries, and finding your chosen family in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power, overcoming betrayal, and finding your true peace.